I'm Silvio Baldessera, and welcome. NORR acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Ungarisin, the Wendat people, and it's now home to diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. NORR also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and the Chippewa bands. Welcome to the 2023 NORR program. 4 noted architects, 2 sustainability engineers, and 2 masters, the architect Alvar Aalto and engineer Peter Rice. I'm the chair of NORR, founder of NORR, and your host. NORR is a continuing education program founded 16 years ago with 3 main goals: to teach, learn, improve, and to do that continuously. The program relies on bringing the best speakers in the 3 series: architecture, engineering, and masters. Each of the NORR virtual sessions since 2020 have been recorded and are available on NORR YouTube for global access. Over the past 15 years, NORR has hosted more than 110 leading guest speakers. Welcome to the 14 NORR offices and our invited guests. Welcome also to the 14 schools of architecture from Canada, the US, and the UK. This is the vision of the Indigenous Peoples space facing the Canadian Parliament buildings in Ottawa, Canada. I'm going to allow our guest speaker to talk about it while I'm going to mention its context. Before I continue, welcome again to the First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit, and the Algonquin. This is an important session in our NORR program guiding principles, which is to teach, learn, and improve. Contextually, this vision is the Indigenous people space, which includes a building dedicated to the Indigenous people in 2017. Last year, this vision was the centerpiece of Block 2, Full City Block International Design Competition, which was won by Zeidler Architects of Canada and David Chipperfield Architects of the UK. Significant is that the Indigenous people space, while the centerpiece of a complex block design, will be designed for the Indigenous people by Indigenous architects who will collaborate with the competition-winning architects completing the entire block design. NORR and Dialogue are compliance architects, and we are proud to be involved in this process with PSCPC on this historic project for the Government of Canada towards reconciliation that our guest speaker and panel will discuss today. The guest speaker, David Fortin, is principal of David Fortin Architect. He is a professor of architecture who has taught in the UK, the USA, and Canada in undergraduate and graduate programs, and has worked with Indigenous communities. David is a member of the REIC Indigenous Task Force to promote Indigenous design in Canada. He was the co-curator with Gerald McMaster of Unceded Canada's entry to the Venice Biennale in 2018. He coordinated a project with the National Research Council of Canada, partnering with various Indigenous architects towards approaches to housing for northern communities. David is a well-known advocate for Indigenous architecture in Canada. David graduated from the University of Saskatchewan in 1997. He received his master's in architecture from the University of Calgary in 2001, followed by his PhD in architecture from the University of Edinburgh in 2009. He is a member of the REIC. David was the first Indigenous architect to be a director of a school of architecture in Canada. In 2018, the MacEwan School of Architecture at Laurentian University. David is a citizen of the Métis Nation of Ontario. Welcome to David Fortin to speak to us on the politics of design in the age of reconciliation. David Fortin.
Thank you, Silvio, for the introduction, and thank you to NORR and your team for the invitation to speak to everybody online today. I also want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Neutral, and the Anishinaabe peoples in the city of Cambridge in Southern Ontario. I realized when I was putting this together last night that I sort of was trying to pack everything into one talk. So there's gonna be a lot of information at sort of a high level, but I thought that it would be a good opportunity to share a sort of high level conversation about reconciliation and design and the relationship between them, because I think this is still a relatively new conversation across our country and around the world, quite honestly. So the title of the talk that's been in all the slides has been The Politics of Design in the Age of Reconciliation. Initially, I also included the bottom part because I'm still asking questions if that is the case, or if we're talking about the politics of reconciliation in the age of design and how to avoid that. So it's quite subtle in between these two titles. But I think the question is, what is the age that we're in? And is reconciliation provide the framework for how we approach design moving forward, or is design the framework that everybody's trying to squeeze reconciliation into? So hopefully that the kind of difference between these two will come more evident as I get talking. The two images that you see on your screen on the left is a drawing of a residential school, and the right is the new Indigenous Reconciliation Center at the UBC campus, designed by Alfred Waugh and Formline. And I put them up there as a pair to show both the incredible damage that architects have played in the history of Indigenous peoples, and also the idea that architecture can be a path forward to healing some of those problems that we've endured. And today's lecture, I'm really going to try to focus more. I'm putting on my professor hat and rather than the work of my firm to really kind of talk about this. This past semester, I taught a course that was titled The Architectures of Reconciliation. And this course started off for 3 or 4 weeks talking about reconciliation globally, and then focusing in on Indigenous issues in Canada with multiple guest speakers. And I found that I learned a lot about this because reconciliation is in our media on a daily basis. Everyone is talking about it. And many non-Indigenous and Indigenous people are sometimes confused as to what they're doing and if they're doing things correctly. And unfortunately, I'm not going to provide any answers today, but I might be able to at least broaden the conversation for those of you that are watching. Just to position myself, my dad's family, or the Whitford family, so that's my grandmother in the center of both of the images on the right. And really, the reason why I start off is to honor my Whitford family, who are Métis people who have, for many generations across the prairies from Red River West, been proud Indigenous Métis people. My dad was an educator, and I grew up in an environment where my dad was very central and remains so to my thinking on Indigenous issues. And I always want to honor them because they give me my voice on these topics, really. My mom's family is not Indigenous. She's a second generation Austrian Canadian. So I want to honor her family as well. But when I'm speaking about topics like today, it's channeling the voices of my ancestors and my family that are scattered across the prairies and in Fort St. John, BC. So one of the lectures that I had with the students was on this question of the political space of architecture. And these were the 3 questions that I opened up that conversation with students with was, is architecture political? Is architectural design political? And if so, then are architects also inherently political? And I just find that often we don't position architecture as being overtly political anymore. Certainly through the last 25 years of my, professional and academic careers, that topic kind of pops up and recedes and depends on who's talking about it. But I don't think most architects identify their work as being overly political. It's more client-driven and those sorts of questions. If you look at the definition of what it means for a politic, it basically comes from the Greeks, of course, and this idea of pertaining to public life. And many people have written about this idea that, what is disciplinary or professionally unique about architectural design is known through its imprint on everyday life. In fact, almost all of our projects in some way or another impact public life, other than, of course, single residential projects and those sorts of things. And so when you put that through the lens of reconciliation and the lines that are drawn on paper, this is an image of a house you can see called the Indian House that was designed as part of CMHC's program. That these things impact people in pretty profound ways, and which is core is what I want to talk about today. Historically, we look at many different generations of architectural thinking has involved political thinking right from the Renaissance onwards. Politics and architecture have been sort of intertwined, really. The last time it kind of, I would argue anyways, made a very strong aesthetic argument was during the postmodern period. This is an image, of course, Philip Johnson on the cover of Time magazine, 1979. And when you look at that era, people were trying to identify what it was that postmodernism stood for. And this comes out of an article on this topic where Mary McLeod writes that, basically the postmodernists were searching for a form of architectural communication. So the desire to make architecture a vehicle of cultural expression. Postmodern practitioners and critics have tended to seek ideological justification, not in program function or structure, but in meaning. Manifesto by the editors of the Harvard Architectural Review declared that postmodernism is an attempt, and an important one, to respond to the problem of meaning, which was posed but never solved by the modern movement. And that kind of, has fizzled out a little bit. I would argue that, questions of phenomenology, materiality, form making, abstraction have taken over the majority of architectural thinking until relatively recently. But it kind of rears its head again if we look at Donald Trump surprising the world. Well, maybe not surprising. I don't think he couldn't shock very many of us, but with this mandate, a new executive order that was going to outlaw modern architecture and bring back classical aesthetics as a symbol of government. So, even though this was a very short-lived moment, it did show that there is still in some people's minds a question of the political language that is used for architecture. And I was reflecting on this over the last 6 months and thinking about, the other political figure that has been a thorn in the sides of all architects, which is now our King, Charles. And what's interesting about Prince Charles is that, when I was certainly in school and most of my professional career, you just kind of think of him as well, you can't take him very seriously. But when you read through Charles's 10 new key principles for design, and think about them in relation to some of the topics I'll talk about today. So developments must respect the land, architecture is a language, scale is key, neighboring buildings should be in tune and in harmony. Well-designed enclosures of building envelopes, local wood beats imported aluminum, limit the signage, don't really know the context for that one. But if you look at these contexts, suddenly Prince Charles' ideologies are starting to feel a lot more conducive with contemporary architectural thinking. So that's just kind of in a very broad sense, and obviously you could go back many generations and talk about these kinds of politics in many different contexts. But for today, I really want to focus in on this question of Indigenous politics of land and place. In 2020-21, I worked with my colleague now here at the University of Waterloo, Adrian Blackwell, on an issue of Scapegoat Journal, which is accessible online if you're interested. And what this conversation started off with Adrian and myself, because Adrian was doing research into basically lot divisions, looking at the work of George Baird in the 70s and the role that the actual delineation of land plays in restricting the possibilities for architecture. And we were talking about basically that land dispossession is of Indigenous people is sort of how that all unfolds in what we now call Canada. So we really felt like this was a topic that was hard to pin down, but one that we felt architects should be talking more about. You know, we too blindly often accept things like setbacks and rights of way and bylaws, and these are essentially the kind of infrastructural parameters that depend or define the architectural output that we all produce. And in essence, this is all started from stealing land from Indigenous people, and then, you know, moving people onto that land, giving it to settlers in different sense of legal negotiations, then, you know, creating a RCMP force to protect people from those Indigenous peoples, and a financial legal system to make those transactions acceptable. So we invited a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to reflect on this, and there's a series of essays that kind of talk about, in my mind, both the fantasy and the perversity of private property. And the title, you'll notice, of that journal is Got Canada Spelt with Backslashes. And this was inspired by Lugigu Patrick Stewart from his PhD that he published in 2015 at UBC. And you can see the backward slash is where he talks about incompatibility. And so in the note below the chart, where he says that Canada, the backward slash is wrong, and it's analogous to the wrongness of this country and its treatment of Indigenous peoples. And we felt it was symbolic in a sense that the line divides up the letters and sort of disrupts your relationship to the word, the same way that property division divides up the land and also disrupts your connection or relationship with the land, particularly for Indigenous people, but for all of us. So as an example of this, I was born in Calgary and raised up near Cochrane for the first few years of my life anyways. And Calgary is an interesting city because of its relationship to the Blackfoot Confederation and the Tsuut'ina Nation here, which I've highlighted, because you've got a very extractive economy in Calgary, you know, that has been expanding geographically fairly rapidly over the last 30 to 50 years. And it's basically growing along the boundary of a First Nation. And what's really fascinating about this particular case is that if you take the lines off of the land itself speaks back to you on where the Indigenous people live and where the non-Indigenous people live. And there's been, in my mind, a sharpening of that line over time, which is also kind of metaphorical for the difference in the two worldviews and how they think about land relations. They've recently opened a Costco on the east side of this community, and they're opening up to development along the edge. So there's some blurring happening now. But the main thing that happens here, and one of the things that I want to emphasize here, is that the idea of earth cannot be separated from the actual being of the Indians, as the Blackfoot philosopher and teacher Leroy Littlebrae has told us. And there's lots of different writings about this. I think people understand that for Indigenous peoples, this is central to their identity and sense of place in the world. And when you compare that to at least certain branches of Western philosophy and theory, Frederick Jameson writes about the ideology of individualization in the Western world. So Jameson writes that one's personal identity is closely linked to the unity and centeredness of the subject or psyche, to my private property, my ownership of my own memories. And as soon as I lose title to them, I lapse into schizophrenic dissolution. So this is something that is, at least for various people, central to the way what differentiates Indigenous and Western perspectives of our identities, which is really central to all of these conversations about politics and design. I had been working on the Indigenous people space and as well with the University Laurentian in Sudbury with Winnie Pitawanakwit, who's a dear friend and an elder and mentor. And at the time, Adrian and I were putting together this journal article, and I had asked her, I was sitting down in my office and I said to her, what do you think about private property? And she kind of asked again what I meant by that. And I said, well, I don't know, just like, the idea of dividing up land and buying it. And she just smiled and she said, I never understood that. She said, like, I don't understand. Do people think they own the trees? Do they think they own the birds or the grass or the flowers or the insects for that matter? Like, there was sort of this moment in her as trying to figure out why humans thought they owned anything. And so I was relaying this to my student at the time, Maeve McDonald, who's now an intern with me. And she was working on a thesis out at Shooking First Nation. And she drew this little diagram that just sort of highlights the perversity of this idea even of drawing in the land and claiming something as yours and that you are the dominion over that space. This has a long sort of history in Western ideologies, essentially, that nature is something for our personal consumption. So everything from the Romantic period onward has this sort of idea of, humans and their relationship to landscape, and this could, I could add a third image here, which is the selfie in the national parks or in beautiful scenic places. But the problem with the national park system, for instance, is that, of course, to make this place a beautiful place for urbanites to come and indulge in, that they ended up violently pushing Indigenous people off of all of those lands, prevented them from hunting the animals in those territories that gave them sustenance. So you have a kind of disconnect between the natural world and the urbanized or the aestheticized world. And just as an example of this, and I apologize, this is pixelated on your screens as well as mine, which is fine. This is Lawsons Plan for the city of Calgary, that they hired him in the early 1900s. And just for context on how this plays out, I was asked to be a guest speaker in an urban course at the University of Calgary. This is a number of years ago now, but the speaker prior to me was talking about how basically the city of Calgary missed out on such a great opportunity to implement Lawsons Plan for Calgary, which was really, people call it Venice on the bow. It was predicated on on Vienna on the bow. But you can see the little boats in there that are these almost Venetian little vessels that move into these calm waters. But of course, if anybody knows Calgary and the Bow River, this actually makes absolutely no sense. And so this person had projected this as a lost opportunity for Calgary's urbanism. And then I followed up by questioning, where were the Blackfoot people in thinking about the establishment of Canada or of Calgary and their fishing and hunting and their relationship to the land. So these are examples on how we have continually just imposed different belief systems into the landscape across our country. As well as part of that conversation about land and land division, I was doing research on my own Métis heritage and architectural topics in that, and came across this map, which I still am so inspired by, I guess, intellectually, because in this one township, this is where the Battle of Batoche happened, so the Riel resistance. And right where you see St. Laurent settlement is where the village of Batoche was and is as a historic site. But what's interesting in this is you have the South Saskatchewan River running through the drawing, and then you have three different sets of land relations. So you have the Dominion grid that was imposed over the land by the settler governments. And the goal here is to distribute land to settlers to farm, and yet you can see how it's totally incongruent with the river itself. So some of those grids, if you look at, say, numbers 25 and 26 on the upper right-hand corner, those automatically have less value than, say, 32, which has a river running around all of its edge for both transport, irrigation, all of those other things. So just by forgetting about the land itself as a thing, it starts to create a differentiation in terms of its value. And then in between the river and the grid is the Métis river lot system, which is inherited from the French, but the Métis adopted this as a spatial system because it was egalitarian to them. So every lot had access to the water and every lot had access to the road. And they would organize their houses along the river's edge, so there was still a sense of community. So it's kind of this hybrid. And then, of course, in the bottom right-hand corner is the One Arrows Indian Reserve, which has no land delineation. And this is how it was perceived by settlers arriving into Canada, was that if it wasn't divided clearly and who owns it and how they use it in a very utilitarian way, then it was open for taking and converting into something that would be more useful from a kind of exchange value perspective. So property infiltrates everything from that point on. And this is really shown 1875. This was a report from the Department of the Interior, where they wrote that even under the most favorable circumstances, time must be given to the Indian to understand the motives and acquire the habits of the white man who labors to accumulate wealth in order that he may have the means of support in sickness or old age, or of giving his offspring a start in life. But when these motives come to be understood and acted upon by the Indian, the evidence of which is the possession of considerable property acquired by his own industry and thrift, it shows that he may safely be entrusted with the rights of full citizenship. I mean, this stuff is, you can't make this up. I mean, it's unbelievable that a group of people would come to another country, steal their land, push them onto reserves where they need a card to get off of the reserve, and then tell them that they have to figure out how to work within a new economic system to prove that they can then buy back the land that was just stolen from them. I mean, it's really kind of unbelievable. If you kind of fast forward that sort of thinking about industry and economies, you end up with further land divisions and kind of unfettered capitalist model of increasing prices and increasing wealth through investments through your house. And so this is just one I snapped a few years ago during the pandemic of a house in Richmond Hill, Ontario that was closing in on $3 million. And really the actual infrastructure for this is not dissimilar to, you know, the early suburban days in the United States and throughout Canada. And I'm not going to talk much about housing today, but just to say that this is the exact same model that then people picked up and ripped these houses out of their root systems and replanted them on reserves, and then asked why Indigenous people, you know, were letting their houses fall apart, even though they had none of the financial motives for their houses. You can't get a mortgage on a reserve. You don't have access to hardware stores. And the actual spatial organization of these spaces were deeply colonial, with deeply rigid frameworks for what that means to exist on land. So the whole kind of financialization of land as property, and this is what we're going to be talking about in the Venice Biennale in a few more months. So I'm a member of a curatorial collection that is going to Venice in a few months, and the title of our project is Not for Sale, looking at basically how financialization of housing, treating the idea of home as a commodity, has alienated Canadians from our sense of place and our relationship to the land. And 3 of the teams are focused on Indigenous issues. So hopefully you guys will be able to keep your eyes open as this develops. In fact, we were just launching our website yesterday, and we're going to be starting a social media push, because we're basically making a case that the Canada Pavilion is going to be turned into a campaign office for decommodified housing, and we're working with teams across the country on this. So it's going to be a really exciting movement, and we're really happy of the kind of input and energy that everyone has given to this. So when you draw things as lines on plan and divide it up, you can see how it infiltrates architectural thinking. A few years ago, I was in conversation with Bruce Mao about this, and he brought this to my attention, talking about how we were taught to design an architecture school. And what do you do when you draw a section? Well, you draw a big, thick black line along the bottom of your drawing for your beautiful work to sit on. and total disregard of what that land may be, right? Whether that might be a fragile prairie ecosystem, whether there are critters living under there, the root systems of the trees, the incredible life of fungi under the ground. We're just taught to treat buildings as if they don't somehow relate to all of that stuff. And there's kind of a psychological and philosophical positioning, even in the way we were taught to draw. And those lines in the land inherently get very political. So, even, the Métis Nation, which I'm a citizen of, questions are always surrounding where the boundaries of the Métis Nation and who is identity should be tied to that nation. Again, I'm from Western Canada, where there's, always constant conversations about a Republic of Western Canada, or at least breaking free from our current government. And there's then the greater politics of this in terms of wars and wall building, and how one identifies with land and place. And so the bottom right image, I was on my way to Toronto for a talk a few years ago, and this was on my feed, and I read this article about nationalism growing around the world. And it really got me wondering, what about the first nationalists in that conversation of, protecting our countries and our countries' identities. And yet First Nations are still fighting for real recognition over what happened, and that all of those nations, particularly I'll say in North America, but many other nations as well, are still sitting on essentially stolen land. So the land back movement is critical to reconciliation. And, again, this many times in history, and will continue, I imagine, to come to points of conflict with our Indigenous communities. So, trying to understand and deal with these zones of conflict, and how architecture responds to it. And this is where I'm going to kind of lean more in towards how does design fit into this narrative? Well, when you're in a context of the images on the left, of disputes over land and the sacredness of that land, and then you have things happening like, thankfully, I think we're moving beyond this, but this is still happening, where, this is an example of, many years ago now, where a family's traditional design from their blankets was just lifted and added as Navajo patterns onto a well-known Urban Outfitters chain without any conversation about that. So, this is not okay. I think most people understanding that Indigenous visuality, Indigenous design is not something that is to be just used frivolously by whoever wants to. And, architects will say, well, we don't do that, but I don't think many of these were designed by, highly reputable architects. But this is just to say that there has been a history of cultural appropriation and exploitation of Indigenous people for profit and gain through a kind of lens of colonial romanticism, or whatever word you want to use to describe that. And throughout history, there are moments of these. And some of them, this visuality or architectural identity is more subtle in a sense, and yet more offensive in other ways. And so I grew up in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and my ancestors are from there. And it took me until I was well into my career before I started to question, why do heritage buildings of Prince Albert focus on replicating this Beaux-Arts aesthetic? And at what point in a boardroom table was it decided that that's the look we should go for in Woodlands Cree territory in Canada? So, you start to say, what does this mean if we go back to the postmodernists asking why meaning is important? It questions who has the agency over this design process. Who is making decisions, and what is the power in that decision-making process? So this is published as an article. So I'm just going to see if I can get this over again. Okay. Just seeing my one. I don't know if that's blocking what you guys are seeing. Just going to move this over. This is published in a book chapter, if anybody's interested. The book is called Design and Agency, and the title of my chapter is called From Indian to Indigenous Agency. And it's really just looking at basic questions again. If we think about the Indian agent and the Indian agency in the United States and in Canada, an agent is one who's authorized to act for or in place of another, while an agency is an establishment engaged in doing business for another. So, you know, I'll come back to this again, but this is sort of the context of design in an age of reconciliation, is questioning what do we do as designers in our societies? You know, we have developed societies that are so specialized that essentially our role is to, at least in public projects and many other contexts, is to act for or in place of another and an establishment that does business for another. That's part of our architectural mandate as public servants in many ways. So in terms of agency and architecture, then, this was brought to me by a researcher, a PhD student from McGill, Magdalena Milos, and her writings on the architectures of assimilation. And again, we don't often think of ourselves as architects as doing things maliciously. But Magda was informed by her master's thesis supervisor, Robert Jan van Pelt here at Waterloo, who had done just incredible work questioning the architects of the concentration camps at Auschwitz, for instance. And so, you know, in that case, when you're drawing a gas chamber, how do you not have an ethical moment where you start to question what you're doing? Now, the school systems are obviously designed in a way that most people of the settler kind would have believed were the right idea. So I don't think there would have been a kind of ethical questioning of this. But you can see here what's so powerful about this drawing is that it's etched in the upper right-hand corner that this is going to go to Chapleau, which is in Northern Ontario. So you have an architectural design that has, before they earmarked it on where it was going to go, it had no relationship to site. It had no relationship to the cultures or the community where it was going to go to. It could have gone to Yellowknife, it could have gone to Alberta, it could have gone to the East Coast. So there's no consideration whatsoever to the land it sits on or the people that it's going to. It had one mandate, and the architects were drawing a building for assimilation. And Robin Evans, you know, this is a canonical text, translations from buildings to drawings and other essays, where he writes that drawing in architecture is not done after nature, but prior to construction. It is not so much produced by reflection on the reality outside the drawing as productive of a reality that will end up outside the drawing. The logic of classical realism is stood on its head, and it is through this inversion that architectural drawing has obtained an enormous and largely unacknowledged power by stealth. And if you think about the role of buildings, whether that be the residential school or the housings on reserve, they were the physical infrastructure to break down Indigenous communities and assimilate them in an attempt essentially to wipe them out. So that chapter and that thinking of that point in my research was to ask, you know, the Indian agent is one who exerts power over Indigenous people. That's what that meant. And how do you turn that into a moment where there is Indigenous agency? So the capacity or the condition or state of acting or exerting power. How do Indigenous people bring back that level of self-determination out of the kind of events of the last 150 plus years? So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples gives us some clues on this. You know, it's interesting, both in this and the calls to action from our own Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there isn't, architecture is not specifically mentioned, but there are two articles that certainly allude to it. So Article 11, number 1 states that Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. This includes the right to maintain, protect, and develop the past, present, and future manifestations of their cultures, such as archaeological and historical sites, artifacts, designs, ceremonies, technologies, visual and performing arts, and literatures. So even though architecture is not mentioned in there, it certainly touches on many aspects of what we do. And then Article 23 is the closest one. to the topic where it says Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for exercising their right to development. In particular, Indigenous peoples have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining housing and other economic and social programs affecting them, and as far as possible to administer such programs through their own institutions. So one of the questions here has always been, what does that mean to be actively involved? And there's a long history in architecture writing about the power imbalances that typically play out in community engagement. And in many cases, there are many people who question the validity of community engagement because it's set up in a way that essentially the architectural teams can move forward with their own agenda in a way that makes it look like the community endorsed them. And then the second part is, how do you do this through your own institutions? And what does that mean? So it's not talking about designing, it's saying that they have the right to be actively involved in developing and administering. But what about design? And who has the authority to design? And that brings us to a question of architects. So there are 10,000 architects in Canada, roughly. We've gone up a little bit over the last number of years, but let's just say roughly. This is just an image I grabbed off the web of 10,000 dots. There are about 20 Indigenous architects in Canada. I think we may have added one or two in the last year. And that's how many fully Indigenous-owned architectural firms in Canada. And this is how many Indigenous-owned firms have more than 10 full-time employees. So what this tells everyone is that Indigenous peoples in our country are still really struggling with capacity to actually push forward, excuse me, an Indigenous design agenda. And in many cases, and the way the economy and the reconciliation initiatives are going is that they are partners of many firms. So design becomes a much more co-design process with Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. And many of those peoples, including my students and many of the people that I work with on a regular basis, are genuinely asking, how do I act within the name of reconciliation? What is reconciliation, and am I doing this correctly? And I think it's a real concern for many people that this is a relational activity, and this is out of a philosophical writing on what reconciliation means. But the key thing here is relational activity. This is an exchange between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples on how to move forward. This is not something that you can, in my opinion, read books on and study. And you can be knowledgeable about reconciliation, but if you aren't relating with Indigenous peoples and understanding what their position is and how to move that path forward, then you're not really on the right path. What we are seeing is that in the architectural community in Canada, at least, and we're starting to see signs of it in the United States as well, which is great, that reconciliation is being reflected on. So if you look across at all our multiple firms across the country, from ACOM and NORR and the others as well on here, that firms are starting to understand that this is not an option. I think that when indigeneity was talked about in the past, many of these firms would have just treated it as a project-specific topic. So, a First Nation needs a school, we're going to design a school for them, we'll focus on Indigenous topics within our team on that. But what we're seeing now is a kind of understanding that this goes far beyond that. It transcends project-specific and is starting to talk more about who we are as a nation and how we relate to these very difficult conversations. And some of these can be very difficult conversations. So I'm going to run through just quickly some thinking on what reconciliation is, and while it's even a difficult word to start from. If you look at the definition of this, what does it mean? Well, it's a state of being reconciled. But the second definition of it is the Roman Catholic sacrament of penance. So that's not a great place to start given residential schools. If you look at the verb to reconcile, it means to restore to friendship or harmony, make congruous. Number 3 is particularly disturbing, to cause to submit or to accept something unpleasant. Don't know many Indigenous people that are interested in that definition of reconciliation. You can look at the etymology of it, where it talks about restoring, bringing together again, win over again, and conciliate. And then if you look at conciliate, the first starting of that word, or the origins of that word, is to overcome distrust or hostility by soothing and pacifying. So, you know, when you kind of package up all of these words, you just kind of feel a little bit like nothing is adequate to properly describe what it is that we're talking about. And we're not the first to do this. And this is why in my course, we looked at questions of truth and reconciliation around the world. I mean, South Africa, the atrocities of South Africa are certainly something that our Indigenous peoples relate closely with. And that has been a painful process. But you can see in the text below that, you know, this idea that no two people have the same definition of what reconciliation means, because you're coming from a place of incredible amounts of hurt, and trying to go forward in a good path forward, and yet still have some level of responsibility for what happened as well. So it leads to apologies, and those are very helpful. And I think that last year, the apology from the Pope was very moving, and it really had an incredibly powerful effect on people, both good and bad. It certainly brought back a lot of pain. And so, you know, I don't want to dwell on the negatives of it, but to say within architecture, when we're talking about truth and reconciliation, architects are always eternal optimists, and we want to make the world better by what we do, and that is great, and that's what we need to do. But we also have to be very sensitive that this is by no means a resolved situation with our First Nations peoples. And Thomas King has written about this, that basically, you know, the apologies continue and yet nothing really changes. And that is really at the core of many of the issues that we're dealing with. So if we look again, just zooming out on the positive side, Indigenous is finally and officially in, right? If you look at the work over the last 4 years or so, let's just say that almost every major firm in the country is engaging in really important work, working with First Nations and trying to grapple with what this means to express land and place and storytelling, Indigenous values, bringing in all kinds of Indigenous people on design teams, and everybody trying to interpret it. And this is where I go back to my opening slides about the politics of design, because it's incredibly reminiscent of some of the arguments that the postmodernists were making in the 70s and 80s, that buildings have meaning, they tell stories. And so whether that be an eel for KPMB, or the grandfather and grand teachings for Dialogue with Smoke, the relations with the land, almost every one of these kind of design strategies has embedded stories in it. And so this is happening across the country, and this is the positive side. And, you know, a decade ago, I was one of the ones arguing that we needed to push for all public projects in Canada. Our taxpayer dollars should be paying for buildings that help us connect with our land and with our peoples and understand where we are in the world. And that's starting to happen. And yet I'm always continually haunted by this essay by a Hawaiian theorist named Poco Luani, where he describes what colonization is. Forget decolonization, which is actually the title of his essay. But he's talking about this is the final stage of colonization, when you realize that the Indigenous people have essentially been assimilated and erased, essentially. He says the traditional culture that simply refuses to die or go away is now transformed into the culture of the dominating colonial society. Indigenous art that has survived may gain in popularity and form the basis for economic exploitation. Indigenous symbols and print may decorate modern dress. Indigenous musical instruments may be incorporated into modern music. Supporting Indigenous causes within the general colonial structure may become the popular political thing to do, exploiting the culture further. This exploitation may be committed by Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous people. So this position sort of, I think, encourages us to take a step back in what we're doing in this path of reconciliation. And I believe it was actually Jake who's on the call here, has publicly encouraged people, reminded people that, reconciliation is not a business model. This is not an opportunity for non-Indigenous businesses and companies to profit and use this for their own gains. That this is really reconciliation goes back to our Indigenous communities and serving them and their needs, and reconciling that relationship moving forward. So it creates some very challenging positions on how we do this in the right way. So in one of my recent book chapters that just pulled this out of there, I was asking, these questions. So if a city looks more Indigenous and has increased number of Indigenous people living in it, but maintains incomprehensible economic and social inequity, as well as environmental devastation, what have we ultimately gained? And that's an important question, because if we're going to put Indigenous teachings and symbologies into the buildings we're designing, and yet society is not living by the value systems, I mean, this can be, I believe, read as a disrespect for those teachings, and we may be disserving our Indigenous peoples more than we are helping the cause. And it further complicates it is just, we happen to have a government which, in a very, in my opinion, a positive way, is trying to walk the walk on what they're talking about with reconciliation. So there's a lot of money involved. And so, if you look at the numbers that are thrown out in the recent budget, you have almost $4.5 billion for the Indigenous Community Infrastructure Fund. You have $4 billion to deal with housing gaps. 300 million on another urban housing strategy. So there is a lot of money, and this is where a lot of people, I'll just share with you again, because we're on the topic of this reconciliation, that probably once every couple of months at least, I get a phone call, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, from a company who thinks they've solved the Indigenous housing project, and they want to, pursue a plant that's going to solve the problem and ship housing out. It's just really repeating all of the bad things that has already gone wrong. Again, because it's starting from a point of how a company wants to profit off of this money, and also the situation we have in our infrastructure and our communities. So this is, again, folding in, Western thinking on this, but I find this helpful to look at the way that some of other thinkers look at similar topics. And Lefebvre is one who talks about spatial justice and these kinds of topics. And Henri Lefebvre talks about place-bound spatial practices must be formulated in a way to confront the spatial sphere in which hegemonic forces are deployed. In other words, these spatial practices occurring in place have to be mindful of the dominant conceived spatial practices operative over space. So this goes back to some of the questions I raised earlier about property, understanding, why do we have property? Who owns that property? Why is this dictating our relationships to the land, and who's making the decisions? All of those kinds of questions are central to architectural production, at least in terms of our positionality and what we're aware of in terms of our agency as professionals. And it starts with questions of, this is from Idle No More, who I'm working with on the Venice Biennale project, but a very simple motto many of you have heard of, I'm sure, which is nothing about us without us. So Indigenous people must be there in these conversations. And it goes back to this question of, what does it mean to be actively involved? We're working through that right now, but at the very least, Indigenous communities need to be part of this conversation. And the government, again, what has been an interesting and positive step forward is this idea of a 5% target in procurement. So giving 5% of Indigenous businesses and mandating that on major infrastructure projects. So this changes the game significantly, and yet talking to people in government, there are other complications. If you look at the red arrow on this, if you look into Indigenous business and federal procurement, then there's this question that is basically, it tells you how to register and self-identify your Indigenous business. Well, this is already starting to cause some problems, because self-identification, as everyone knows, in the world of pretend Indians and other things that are going on, there are many people trying to exploit the opportunities for themselves. And so the government is having to, I think, juggle that also in terms of all of this, is set their aspirations, and then also trying to figure out where the capacity is for Indigenous businesses to fulfill those mandates. And this also comes into the design world. And that kind of thinking of including Indigenous people sounds very natural and obvious at many levels. If you think of our elder and really our mentor, Douglas Cardinal, the well-known Blackfoot architect and Anishinaabe elder, there was a lot of politics around Douglas's earlier career when he received projects like the Museum of History in Ottawa. But you know, this was built from and awarded to him essentially through Pierre Elliott Trudeau's relationship with him and interest in him, and other people who wanted to endorse Douglas's approach to design in our Capitol building. But it also was a continuation of already a very established and incredibly innovative career in Canadian architectural history. And yet, again, when you think about the politics of design, in New York Times in 1996, Patricia Brown wrote that his high-profile commissions and ability to straddle two worlds, the ones of pinstripes and buckskin, at the opening of the Civilization Museum, he wore both, have prompted some resentment and rancor within the Canadian architectural establishment. He appeals to the guilt of the nation, said Beth Kapusta, an editor at Canadian Architect magazine in Toronto. Hiring him is a method of absolution. So here, Douglas's position as an Indigenous person is immediately politicized, and I find that quite shocking. You know, now thinking about today's context, I think, well, many people wouldn't expect to hear those things, but I will also say I've been in meetings in the last year where similar comments are made on various contexts. So that kind of feeling of questioning again, where do we get Indigenous people in and get their voices and give them some control and power over the design process is a challenge. You know, Douglas also famously has said many times that he will not be Tonto on a project. He says that Indigenous people have been taught too often that their role is to serve the Lone Ranger, and he claims that he's going to be the Lone Ranger. So what does reconciliation mean for topics linked to contemporary architecture in Canada? And I'm just going to kind of go through these relatively quickly. And I think part of what I was thinking here is maybe people on the call are not you know, too familiar with what is going on and what is happening in architecture, because in practice, as we know, you tend to be wrapped up in your own clients and your own priorities. So there are things changing. On one hand, for instance, there's a small scale to this. So this is from an essay that I wrote a few years ago with Jason Sirkin, another Métis architect who interned with me. And, you know, you look back at Kenneth Frampton, who many people have read, I'm sure, and what that idea of critical regionalism was. And I thought it was interesting reading Frampton in the context of indigeneity, because, of course, critical regionalism to a degree is certainly supportive of, let's say, contemporary Indigenous design. But, you know, he had once hoped that regionalism could resist the thrust of modernism's unabated goal of universal neutralization. But then, you know, more recently, he sort of has accepted that that's not going to be possible. So again, I'm just going to read. He says, he states, it cannot alter the dominant spectacular techno-scientific global corporate discourse. However, he adds that critical regionalism is nonetheless still able to articulate a resistant place form within a smaller society, which here and there may maintain a dissenting cultural and political position. So, you know, when we were doing research on Métis communities in the prairies, for instance, we were looking at things like smoke shelters and the ingenuity of the smaller material culture of the Métis people, which is profound. This is a house that I visited, built by a Métis member of the East Prairie settlement. And so there's a small scale, kind of a humbleness to us to say design isn't defined by the meta narratives of, you know, what we see on Dezeen and everywhere else. For Indigenous people, there's a humble relationship to land and to materiality and making things that is a valid design conversation, and that has a power in and of itself. There's also promoting Indigenous-led design. So again, as Silvio mentioned, the idea of Voices of the Land was essentially, we got together with a few of us at the beginning, and the group grew over time to basically say, you know, how do we, well, I can tell you that this came out of an article that I'd read where another architect had mentioned that, you know, Indigenous people were thriving in the arts, they were thriving in music, they were thriving in the visual arts, but there were so few of them in architecture that you couldn't even count them, which the implication was that there were no Indigenous architects. And having known a lot of these people for a few years, I thought to myself, well, that's kind of crazy, because just because they're not in Canadian Architect or in the media as the you know, Arch Daily, that doesn't mean that there aren't Indigenous architects. And most of these people were working very productively with communities, doing very important work that didn't register on the scale of being interesting to mainstream architectural media. So we pulled everybody together and we put together this project that positioned architecture as storytelling, that, you know, buildings weren't the most important factor, that buildings were one component of landscape and voices and music, and that this was kind of architecture as part of a living culture of contemporary Indigenous peoples. And so that group, and they're all so inspiring. I mean, they could all be on here giving incredible talks in all of their work. And it's been really great to see everybody's calendars fill up with more work since Unseated, because people are now understanding that they bring a certain value to projects. And I want to share just one example, which was the one that Silvio introduced at the beginning, which was the Indigenous Peoples space. And just for context, what had happened is the Assembly of First Nations had been working with, I believe, NORR's team, actually, with a group of people, and on the context of Block 2, which Silvio mentioned. And what had been happened is the government gifted the Indigenous peoples a Cass Gilbert building on Wellington Street, which is a heritage building. And so the AFN was interested in reaching out to Indigenous architects to say, what would an Indigenous vision, you know, like they're not architects necessarily, they were looking for something that would excite them about what they could do with that building. And so we were selected to go forward with that, and we formed this team, including a Lady of Smoke, Wanda Della Costa, myself, and Winnie, and the rest of our teams below, including Nicole Luke, who's an Inuit descent architect intern right now in Winnipeg. And we went forth on this journey to look at the building. And this is, you know, the context for the Indigenous people space. For those of you that aren't familiar with the project, I don't know if you can see my cursor, I'm assuming you can. This is our center block of our Parliament building, which is the iconic identity for our nation in many ways. And these orange buildings are the buildings that were gifted to the Indigenous peoples, which was the former US Embassy. So, you know, the embassy was built here, and at the time it was built there because Canada had proclaimed that Canada's most important relation with the world was with the United States. But Trudeau, very rightfully, when gifting this building, had said, we now recognize that our most important relationship is with our First Nations and Indigenous peoples. So that in gesture, this was all made a lot of sense. So when we were looking at this from a siting perspective, where this sacred fire is laid out right now is right now a plaza where people get in line for tickets to the Parliament building. And we felt like this was an amazing opportunity for a sacred fire on access with the Centennial Flame. Because the Centennial Flame is this kind of, again, point of national pride on Parliament Hill, but for Indigenous people, you know, 100 years is a very short time period on this land. So this idea of a nation-to-nation access was what drove our thinking, and we wanted to claim the space to the east of the building for a sacred fire, and knowing that for the Algonquin people, if there were ever to be ceremony before an important meeting, or say they wanted to light a sacred fire, for ceremony, that east entry is very important to the Algonquin peoples and the Anishinaabe peoples. So we broke out of the property lines, and the lighter orange area, which you can see here, this was the property line. And we met with PSPC a few times, and they were kind of saying, well, you know, you can do what you want, but essentially this is your property line, and you all have responsibilities as architects to adhere to your property line. And that really threw us for a whirl, because the problem was, is we had this is the building, we had this beautiful cast Gilbert jewel that we weren't allowed to touch because of its heritage status. And then we had a block 2 was about to be developed. So you couldn't touch the red building. The rest of it, they told us, were going to be office buildings, but we could go up to 7 stories in between the 2 orange buildings, which was this purple. And in one of these meetings, it really took the wind out of our sails. Both a lady and Wanda would kind of gasped at this and laughed out of sadness. And somebody had said, great, we get to indigenize the loading dock. And that was a hard moment for us. And we went back to the drawing table with Winnie. And at that point, Winnie was our rock. And she said, you know what, you guys, just design something your grandmothers would be proud of. Just forget about everything else. Because we knew what we were going to propose was never going to get built anyways. We were just trying to, I think, fulfill an exercise for the Assembly of First Nations. So again, just the quote on there showing how land division and setbacks and the rules we make for a colonial system, this is where this leads to when you're trying to do the most important Indigenous project, maybe one of the most important Indigenous projects in this country's history. So in other words, after Winnie had said that, we basically decided to go rogue a little bit. And, we talked to PSPC and just told them that we needed to do something that expressed something much bigger than a gesture of a loading dock. And so, I won't go into the full-on design of this, other than to say that we really tried to honor the Algonquin wigwam, thinking about the form making as that, but also looking to our broader Indigenous communities. So things like these multicolored, snowshoe forms that are all over that. The idea was that, we would sort of come up with some sort of design scheme, but then each community across the country would design their own. So, if you came from whichever First Nation across the country, you could come to Ottawa and see your place that you were on Parliament Hill facing the government. And we really felt it was crucial to create this outdoor space where there would be that sacred fire, but also so that people who came to Canada could see teepee raisings, for instance. There could be in the winter, maybe, the Inuit could do snow teachings. There could be a powwow out there. And then the other thing that I'll just point out, in our scheme, we had thought of, we could put the Turo wampum belt that would connect the 2 flames as, again, a symbol of, if you don't know about the Turo wampum belt, basically it's an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the settlers, the Dutch originally, that there are 2 canoes and we will coexist in our canoes, but we're not going to mess with your canoe and you don't mess with ours, and go back to that kind of arrangement where Indigenous people have self-determination and sovereignty. So there are a bunch of symbols and design decisions that we wanted to pursue with this project. The other thing that's happening is a pedagogical reset. So thinking about how we learn about architecture. So when I was at the MacEwan School, we did an analysis in 2015. And this was really under the vision of really, in my mind, a visionary, Terence Galvin, who took the initiative to create a different kind of architectural curriculum where indigeneity wasn't a little elective you could take, but it was embedded throughout the undergraduate curriculum in meaningful ways wherever we could. And so we actually went through this and found out where people were teaching Indigenous content. And this wasn't non-Indigenous people teaching everything. Usually this involved bringing Indigenous peoples in. So you're actually building relations with your First Nations communities through the way you teach architecture. And bringing elders into the building as architectural teachers. So that idea of in-house Indigenous elders and knowledge carriers was started with the MacEwan School. And this was, at least in my opinion, quite radical. And it was radical at the time. And, urban legends tell us that people rolled their eyes at this idea originally, thinking this is silly. What does that have to do with architectural thinking? And now we are, 11 years later, and almost every school in the country is starting to do similar things. So, the MacEwan School had again, from Terence's work with Dalhousie University and Richard Croker and others, had brought in the idea of birch bark canoe building to the MacEwan School, where every student built birch bark canoes with elders to understand the teachings, that the canoe isn't so much an artifact for what it looks like or what it's made of only, but also what it does and how it connects you to the land. So again, using architectural design pedagogy to get people connected in with the land. and then start to fold in Indigenous voices into the architectural curriculum. So, it's not until years later that Jake and I, who we'll talk to in a minute here, I think we'd come to the realization that we were probably the two first full-time Indigenous faculty members at a School of Architecture in Canada at the time. And this was the first Indigenous graduate studio at the school. And we had Eladia Patrick and Chris Cornelius, who's just an incredible architect from the States, come. We had an elder from the community, and these were design reviews where Indigenous people were talking about Indigenous architecture. In my opinion, one of the first times. It's usually just one of us trying to, talk on behalf of Indigenous peoples. But here we had a critical conversation about, symbology and literal, what you do literally and where it gets too literal and where you abstract and those sorts of narratives. The other thing that the MacEwan School was a leader on, and something I'm working on here at the University of Waterloo, is signage in the buildings. So you can see to the left, this project was designed by Levitt Goodman Architects. And it was part of the consultation with the community that the signage would have English, French, and Anishinaabemowin, and everything. So throughout the building, you are honoring the language of the place where you are. Too often we're forgetting that, signage and wayfinding says something about, again, who's doing the writing. And just some other examples, the University of Manitoba has been doing really progressive things, and they have a strong Indigenous student base there, which is really great. Sean Bailey's been brought on as a scholar doing Indigenous scholar doing land-based education. And it's impacting our classrooms as well. So this was a studio that I did just this past year with in collaboration with Global Affairs Canada. And so again, talking about the politics of reconciliation. Global Affairs Canada has this very interesting and I would say a bit of a daunting challenge to think about how do you represent Canada as essentially a colonial state in a place like Mexico, where there's also tensions between Indigenous peoples and the colonial imprint, and how do you kind of think about reconciliation moving forward? So they had they're questioning within their organization, what is the future of diplomacy in the age of reconciliation? And then how does an architecture respond to that? So, there's a very interesting studio to work with non-Indigenous students and have them design, as any firm who's going to end up doing these embassies. How do you fold in Indigenous teachings in a way that is not cultural appropriation, that is sensitive to the realities, and tries to represent all of Indigenous Canada? So, you can imagine how easy that task was for a group of third-year students, but they did really great work. And University of Waterloo and others are all doing these commitments to decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation. And so Bill Woodworth is now an elder in residence here at the School of Architecture. And so much like the MacEwan School and in other places, we are trying to have Indigenous presence in an architectural learning environment to show that this is not optional. This is part of the context where you practice architecture, and everybody needs to be educated on these aspects as kind of members of this society. And on this one, I'll just say that there's an essay that I've wrote recently called The Design Lodge. And in this one, if I had another 3 hours, I would go into it, but essentially just questioning why do we design in studios, and what is an alternative for teaching Indigenous approaches to design? Why are we always having to conform Indigenous teachings into the infrastructures and frameworks of Western architectural pedagogy? There's some very big questions that we are dealing with here. Lastly, these are going to go through very quickly, just to say that I'm sure many people are noticing that some of the biggest steps forward are happening like this is historical. We're in a historical moment where things like the urban reserves, the Squamish Nation, and also Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg are into the urban environment and turning into major developers, which is going to generate major economic impact. So this is a turning point, I think, and there will be learning curves on all of this as this folds into the urban narratives of our cities, but certainly a big step forward. There are some very grand narratives happening here. For one, along the Grand River, right where I'm sitting, that again, I won't go into this. I'm not a knowledge carrier on this stuff, but when you read up and hear from the Six Nations peoples, Canada never paid for the land that it said it would. And if you were to factor in inflation, we're looking at the government owing Six Nations somewhere in the realms in the trillions of dollars that would pretty much bankrupt our government for the land that was negotiated but never paid for. So the Haldimand Tract area was negotiated, and then the government spent the money and never paid it. So these are big questions. These are not. This is when we're talking about indigeneity and reconciliation. This might not impact us in our day-to-day work as architects right now, but for instance, they are calling for, the Six Nations are calling for a moratorium on development on the Haldimand Tract right now until this gets resolved. So in the future and right now, this does have indirect impact on the work of architects, and really should make us think about why we're designing what we're designing. And the last thing I want to just share is this idea of what is Indigenous futures. This is part of reconciliation. You know, Douglas Cardinal in 1991 wrote that we have been programmed for self-destruction. We must understand that a programmed inferiority complex means that someone else has written the script. Douglas has famously said many times that the teachings of the elders are not about the past. These are not historical teachings. They are about the future. They are our path forward, both for Indigenous, non-Indigenous, Canadians alike. This is the future if we want to kind of survive it in terms of what's going on with our planet. And so we're seeing a lot of Indigenous peoples starting to occupy that space of what is the future and what is our relationship to it, and how do Indigenous teachings and languages, land relations, how do we keep those moving forward in good ways in the future? And these are really very important political positionings. So those are all just some of the groups that are doing these things. And I want to end actually on this one, because I think this is a Sudbury 2050 Urban Design Competition in 2020. And when I was at the MacEwan School, we kind of administered this, and various groups submitted projects for this. The images on the right are stills from a film that they had made. And it was a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. You know, Will Moran is a knowledge carrier at the MacEwan School, and Emilio Portal was working there at the time, and some Indigenous students from the school. But their summary is quite, I think, very important. And I'm just going to read what they said about it. So it's called The Story of Healing. And Sudbury is located within Anishinaabe Atikameksheng territory. Atikameksheng people and values lead the changes needed in our systems, industries, practices, and decision-making structures to heal ourselves and the earth. The urban core reflects and is guided by Anishinaabe identity and values. The project name includes Mashgigage, meaning to make medicine in Anishinaabe. To make medicine is to have a relationship with the land. And so, you know, aside from formal qualities, they have this idea of the main city council meeting chambers is above the river. So, you know, the river flows underneath these meetings. So you're making decisions surrounded by the importance of the water, which they're, you know, daylighting. And that, if you think about that this is really starting to move forwards in terms of reconciliation. This isn't, you know, making a building look like a teepee, or, you know, putting a star blanket on a glazing system. This is where the Anishinaabe people are in that room, and they are guiding decision making, and that reflects itself in the built environment moving forward. So it's one of these grand narratives that I think hopefully helps people understand that when we're talking about architecture and reconciliation, this is a long game that's going to take generations to get the right level of Indigenous self-determination and agency into that conversation. Thank you, Marcy. I'm going to stop sharing, and we can have a conversation. I apologize, I went a little bit late.
Thank you, David. This is a very timely presentation, and tying this in with reconciliation is a very important time for all of us. I'd like to bring on the panelists to continue the conversation. I'd like to bring on Amisu Wapisu, who is Nihu Shiku, living in the Anishinaabe territory. Her PhD dissertation is titled Tahami, Housing, Architecture, and Home Territories in the 20th Century, Invisible Spaces Shaping Historical Indigenous Education. It implores the ways in which Indigenous people have maintained their cultural and spatial heritage, even while forced to inhabit architecture that follows colonial paradigms. Omisu co-wrote the Federation of Subversion Indigenous Nations Women's Commission submission to the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and 2S LGBTQIA people. For the past several years, she has been an assistant professor in the Department of Education at the University of Prince Edward Island, and she has a suite of courses on Indigenous cultural and values and emergency legacy of the residential schools. Omisu is co-appointed with the Israeli School of Architecture and Urbanism at Carleton's School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies and Department of History. Welcome, Omisu. Our second panelist is Jake Chisholm, is a Cree from the Massihou territory situated in Northern Ontario. Jake is cross-appointed with Carleton's School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies. He is currently a doctoral candidate with UBC's School of Community and Regional Planning, SCARP, and a research focus on resiliency and internal migration and displacement of Indigenous communities. He brings forward a cultural narrative about the way Indigenous practitioners come to bear the historical injustices imposed upon Indigenous communities and sociological forces that continue to shape and often ill-define the working relationships with Indigenous communities. Jake is an active member of the RAIC Indigenous Task Force and has been involved with the development of national architecture policy for Canada and centralized value inclusion of Canada's Indigenous people, presence, livelihood, and well-being across built environments. In 2008, Jake was a contributing artist to Canada's participation with the Venice Biennale, and it was also part of the team for the Indigenous architecture and designers responsible for Unseated. Welcome, Jake. And I think I'm going to turn it over to David to start the discussion. Jake, you want to turn on your camera, please? Perfect.
Sorry about that. Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Marcy, to both Omisu and Jake for taking the time. And sorry, I went a little bit long, but I know you're both working in similar spaces, and I'd like to, hear what you thought, obviously, about various aspects of this. But I just wanted to go back to the title that I opened with and reflect on that a little bit more with you guys, because I'm wondering what your thoughts are about whether we're in the age of reconciliation or whether we're in the age of design. And I think for me, I know both of you have read Tuck and Wang's article on decolonization is not a metaphor. And one of the things that many people are taking, just for everyone's benefit, this is a seminal text that is worth, I think, everybody actually reading it. I assign it in almost every class that I have nowadays. But where the attempt to decolonize, they talk about moves to innocence, where non-Indigenous peoples sort of adopt this methodology in a way to relieve some of the guilt over what has happened, make themselves feel better. But at the end of the day, nothing changes. Nobody loses their land, nobody's loses their raise, they still go on their vacations, life goes on as normal, only now they feel good because they've done something for Indigenous people. So that to me is what the age of design would be like. It's the age of design, we're just plowing through as architects, we're designing, and now we've got this new little thing in our periphery called reconciliation, and we're trying to figure out how to do it in a certain way. But the steam engine is design practice, and it's just going on its own thing. The real title of this was that age of reconciliation and the politics of design. If it's truly an age of reconciliation, then everything changes. and really the philosophy of reconciliation that at least some of the people that I was reading of, it involves sacrifice. It means you can't have what you think you're going to have if you really mean to reconcile. So the whole question of land back, the whole question of folding in others, sacrificing space for other people, and being okay with that. So that's sort of, at least in my preliminary thinking on that, that's sort of the difference between the two. Is design just its own machine that's just doing its thing, and indigeneity is just going to get folded into it? Or are we legitimately in a kind of time shifting moment in Canada where, the architecture is going to need to respond to these massive shifts? That's a good starting point, and anything else you want.
Oh, I'm laughing out loud. Okay. Thank you, David. I was like, please stop talking. Every sentence is just too full of too many good ideas, and it's hard to keep track of them all. So thank you so much. It was a really excellent presentation, and you touched on so many things in such a cogent way that I could never do. So great. I will just, I don't know what Jake's thinking face is, but I feel like he's still thinking. So I'll just, you brought us back to your title, but I felt like you decimated this concept of reconciliation in your description and definitions. So I think we don't need to worry about that anymore. But I understand where you're coming from in regards to design. And one of the very first things I wrote, actually the first thing I wrote down as notes is architecture political and are architects politicians? And I think recognizing architects in that way sort of needs to underpin the practice of the discipline. So I'm not going to say too much, but I would like to hear what Jake has to say. I thought that was, for me at least, pointed to which direction this needs to go in order to for architects to claim as well as to forward visions for humanity, which is kind of the business I'm in. When I teach my students, I think more than anything about how am I supporting these people to be the best humans they can be. And that's how I see architecture fitting in. How does architecture help humans be better humans? And I don't mean that in a like, how many PhDs and how many houses and how many boats and how many vacations and how many yachts. I mean that in a way of how do you relate to other people? Do you love other people and other beings? And do they love you? Can you take care of one another? And how well do you do that?
I guess you're waiting for a response from me. I lost connection there for a second when Omiasa was speaking, but I think what really struck me is the title. When you talked about this era of reconciliation, and so the TRC Commission of Canada formed in 2008. That was 15 years ago, right? So we've been around the block once. But I think we're around the block the third time, really, because the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, started in 1991, which was 32 years ago. So we're still kicking the can 32 years later. And the nature of that document was to investigate this relationship we had between Indigenous people in Canada. So I see where, I'm curious to see what the next round is going to be. It's we're still spinning our wheels in many ways, right? And another key point that really stuck out to me in your presentation was when you talked about the land back movement. This whole notion of violence, that is something that hasn't really occurred. And I think about reconciliation in the large urban environments where it's safe, but it's small town Canada, small town Saskatchewan, small town Winnipeg, Ontario, Northern Ontario, Thunder Bay. This is where the real violence is inflicted on Indigenous communities. And these are places off the map, right? They're out of sight, out of mind. So I really question this notion of reconciliation in these small fishing villages in Mi'kmaq territory. We've seen that violence inflicted a number of decades now. So I come at it from a different perspective, and I think about the real atrocity of what violence is and what architecture is as a violent form of development for any community, right? And the fallout effects that comes with that. Another piece that really stood out inside your talk was about this notion of a coexisting. I think I've said this before. It's very hard as an academic and practitioner to really grapple with that notion of wanting to coexist or find common ground with the dominant other, when in fact we all know, everybody on the call will realize that so much has already been taken from indigeneity, from the land, the language, the children. And so institutes and practices are grappling for knowledge, and now they've got a price on the creativity of Indigenous people. And big communities, big firms, they want to commission. So you know what, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna cherry pick our young interns because we want the big commission. You know, so let's not deny that. And this whole notion of economic reconciliation, I find that interesting too. You know, this whole notion of where that is taking us. It's just the latest branding of indigeneity, right? Economic reconciliation. So
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that for a couple of points for us to ponder, you know, as we move forward.
I have to say 3 cheers, Jake. Sorry, David. I just wanted to follow up on what Jake brought up, because he brought up what I'm teaching this term to the architecture students at Carleton, which is these 3 major policy documents. And we're reading them backwards, because this one, every single academic talk that I've been to of all time, this isn't mentioned even. So Jake, we need to be talking about your 4th kick at the can. So this report is just as important as the TRC, just as important as the RCAP, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and is even more recent, but it's on no one's mind. And that boggles my mind as an Indigenous woman, as a person who lives in Canada, because protecting Indigenous women, girls, protecting women and girls, period, seems to me fundamental, again, to my first point, to having a humane humanity approach to life. How do you have life without women and girls? You can't. As well as, of course, to us LGBTQ people. So I was just reviewing. So this is the first thing the architecture students began with, this entire document, and also working on positioning themselves as what does this history say to them, and what is their own history that they're bringing to their practice is the whole point. And with all of the recommendations, architecture is implicated in all of them, because how can you create an equitable relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people without creating the spaces where we can actually exist equitably, where we're not sitting together in a form of domination or privilege, like literally how we sit together, and how we sit together behind a desk, behind a lectern, or on the floor, on the ground, really helps us to recreate the relationship we want, but we're not sitting in that way. So physically, architecture has the opportunity to create the space that then helps create a more equitable relationship. So I just wanted to put my plug in for the for the 4th report, because it is just as important as all of the others.
I think it's a really very important point. Again, I think it goes to the question of future thinking, right? Like getting out of the habit of thinking that the Band-Aid is going to hold it. Like we got to think beyond all the little moves into the bigger narratives. I was thinking about your comment about the violence in rural. I had a slide in here that I pulled out at some point, but a few years ago, some of you remember there was a shooting at the La Loche in northern Saskatchewan, and I always found it was so amazing that the story came out because the mayor of La Loche wanted the school torn down because of the shooting. And I always thought, wow, that's so interesting, because in essence, in the hurt of that community, the villain in the story was the school. And why was that? It was a very emotional reaction. And I would assume that the architectural firm that designed and built that school would never imagine that their school would be demolished. I don't think it got demolished in the end, but that was a very visceral reaction to tragedy. It was the school, and the school needed to go. So I find that quite fascinating, and also across the country, the different reactions to the residential schools themselves in terms of the violence. And I wanted to just share too with everybody. I mean, these are the things that, you know, I said I could talk for hours on this stuff, but I think there's a project that I can't name specifically in Ottawa, but where the federal government is wanting to do a very significant project, and it involves Indigenous artifacts, let's just say. And so the Algonquins have been brought on to talk about this. Well, The problem is on the site is a heritage Roman Catholic building. And the community has been asked to say, can we keep the building? We're going to build around it. We can, we'll indigenize it. We'll do everything right. And multiple times the community has come back more forcibly every time I've been involved in these conversations, is to say, no, we're not going to budge on this one. And to me, it's one of the reasons why I started this course, because over multiple meetings, it's like $1 billion project now on hold. It's over a year on hold because of this conversation about a building and its significance, because the heritage folks are also digging in. And they're saying, look, well, this is important to our community. This is an important part of Canadian history. This question of whose heritage we're protecting has come up. And it's called a stalemate to the point that the site will probably go. And I find myself reflecting and getting, at one point, after they've already been told multiple times that the community doesn't accept this building, they're saying, well, can't we envision the space of the chapel as symbolic of reconciliation? So like we come together around, is there any way we can frame this about a space to come together? So eventually I got so frustrated, I said, okay, I don't want to be melodramatic here, but what you're talking about, if they've already told you multiple times, it's kind of like going to a Jewish community and saying, is there any way we can use the swastika as a symbol of us coming together and getting along over it? Like, you can't at a certain point. And this is these very difficult, emotional, raw conversations where buildings are the key piece in the conversation, our historical buildings. I mean, those are very interesting. I keep on thinking to myself, we just got to get rid of the building. Like, to your point, Jake, they've given up so much. Look around this city. It's nothing but colonial buildings. You can sacrifice one of them. But it's
David, that's a great example. I just want to touch on something Amisa said at the very beginning, because it was one of the things from your presentation that I actually wrote down at the start, and that's the politics in architecture. And the three of you are doing some great things in teaching at schools of architecture, and certainly when I went through schools of architecture, there was nothing taught. I mean, it was absolutely nothing. I mean, I went through school in the 70s, and Indigenous architecture was definitely not on the curriculum whatsoever. And it's interesting, the politics in architecture. We did a NORR a couple of years ago, and one of the European architects said that when he went through school in Europe, it was all about politics. And it's interesting that in Europe, politics in architecture was and still is incredibly important, but yet in Canada, in the architecture schools, has never been important, and it was never part of why we were in architecture. It was all about designing and doing things, certainly when I went through. And it's refreshing to see now that, certainly in the last, 10 to 15 years, Indigenous architecture, and you guys are doing fantastic work. You really are in bringing to the forefront. My question is, how are the students reacting to that? And does politics come into that? And are they seeing architecture in a different way? Because in the end, kind of not regardless, but you're having a great effect on what's happening in architecture today. But those students are the future, and I know that we've got a lot of them on NORR Ed right now, and we tend to have a lot of students on. How do you see those students reacting to it, and are they more, politically inclined to look at architecture than I used to be when in the 70s when I went through?
I mean, I'll jump in quickly on that. I think that's a really great question, and I think it obviously varies. And to the last part of your question, are they more politically inclined? Absolutely. I mean, these students are generally pretty well versed in this stuff. They are very aware. They are cautious and respectful for the most part, I find. So I do often think about that. It's going to be great in 20 or 30 years when these are the architects that are leading these firms, because I think there will be, how that manifests, I don't know. I would say that in my reconciliation course, you know, one of the things that I learned a lot from doing this course was I learned, you know, so the assignment I gave the students was everybody had to do research on their own. It's kind of actually inspired by Jake, when, of course, he used to teach. They had to research their own histories on where their families came from and where there may have been political oppression and discrimination in their past. And I'm not exaggerating, like 85% of the students were either first generation Canadians or their parents had immigrated from other places, and many of them fleeing oppression, you know. So they're writing about residential schools in places like South Korea, with the Japanese occupation of South Korea, and basically doing the same thing, taking out their language, putting them in schools, and all these places around the world. So what I found was very interesting is that a lot of these students, for the first time, were researching some of that stuff, interviewing their grandparents and trying to figure out where they came from. And when they layered that on top of the topics we were looking at with our Indigenous people, it certainly gave them a very rich understanding. You know, you had students writing in and saying, wow, my grandfather made a lot of money by selling a lot of properties in Toronto, and basically given myself and my family everything we have, and it was stolen land. And I never thought about it like that before. Yeah. So, you know, like I said, I don't know how it manifests other than a positionality moving forward that has to change something. But yeah, I think they're very receptive and open-minded, but a lot of them are confused too. You know, like there's a lot of that hesitation now, saying, what do I do now? Like, this is terrible. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to perpetuate the problem. And architects are the same way. Once you start talking to architects nowadays, a lot of people aren't sure about the right path forward. So yeah, Jake and Lisa.
Yeah, I would say that it's the speed at which a lot of the students are being exposed to what's going on around the world with global Indigenous affairs. It's incredible. And getting back to David's presentation, even the use of language, like, we don't own the term Indigenous. Like, it's not a Cree term. I know we identify as Mushkegowuk people, right? So then when I claim my indigeneity, I claim it from that position of being Mushkegowuk. But when I say Indigenous, there's Indigenous people from all over the world, you know, and everybody gave up something, gave up part of their identity. So by getting the students to realize you're a third or fourth generation immigrant or new settler, right? There was a lot of giving up in that process, and indigeneity, as my grandparents gave up a lot of their identity for myself to be where I am today, right? So I try to really focus in on the notion of, you know, English being problematic to begin with in terms of how we describe this stuff. So if we can actually get students to claim their identity in their language, you know, then we can have a deeper conversation towards reconciliation. Then I can really ground my identity in a certain part of the world, you know, and have that student do the same thing. And I think graduate students, at least my graduate students, are at that place of, you know, contemplation right now, and getting them to think and sit long enough on the idea of what does land mean, you know, as a provocation for a first year course or a graduate course, right? So yeah, trying to balance the speed, but also the patience required to have these difficult conversations.
How's
sorry,
Silvio,
is it okay if I jump in?
Sure, Shaya.
Thank you. Okay, so being an historian working in an architecture school, I will never give up. I've told everybody it's so much fun. I love the students. They're so creative and so interesting to me. And I just have to take out my hair because I have to do a hair flip. Apparently, Jake and I were the most sought after instructors for the final exam crits, or whatever they're called, Jake. And unfortunately, I couldn't arrive, like I wasn't available to actually provide this service to the students. But our colleague was explaining that because the students now recognize Indigenous territoriality, which is a fundamental, I think, teaching point on Turtle Island, also known as Canada, United States, and parts of Mexico, that they recognize that these are the voices that they need to hear and the perspectives that they are urgently in need of. And so I think that that's so exciting that their thirst for that knowledge is so prevalent and top of their minds. So it's really exciting to be there with them on that journey. And it's also exciting to be here with the two of you, because I'm always so happy to hear that the way that I'm approaching educating architecture students is resonating amongst actual architects. So that's really nice as well. But yeah, I think they're really amazing young people. And I wanted to work with them because they're so creative. So yeah, I mean, people always have potential, but I feel like the youngest have the most. And so that's why it's so fun to work with them.
David, in your practice, I think your presentation was just mind shattering. I mean, just the history and how you've, the education in the presentation was just, just there was so much there. And how do you find dealing with clients and getting that message across with clients? Because that's the message is there, but how do you convince clients and that come from it from a completely different side? I think students are one thing, and I think students, you can spend more time with them. You've got more time in doing courses, and then you have years after years with students. But how do you find clients? I mean, the government clients I think are a little bit easier because they're coming from a different location. But how do you find dealing with clients and getting the message to the clients?
Well, I think that I'm very lucky in a sense because I do consulting and work collaboratively with government, which I find quite rewarding because, like you said, they're sort of easy collaborators because they're all on the same page wanting to do the right thing. And the other group of people that I work mostly with, the vast majority of my work right now is with Western Métis communities. Again, for the Métis people, that even the thought that design could support and enrich their cultural expression through a building is fairly new to many of them. So they're incredibly excited when we come up with concepts that say this is informed from, this historical aspect of Métis people, and they can see it and they get sort of. So, I mean, most of the clients that we're working with are either First Nations or Métis communities that are very receptive to this idea. And the other thing that I would just add to that, though, is that, there's one community in Alberta that we've worked with. I just had a thesis student who did a master's thesis on the teepee teachings and a whole conversation about teepees, which was all really interesting information for me. And so we started working with a First Nation that were doing housing. And so I brought up I was interested in learning more about teepee teachings from their community. And right away they were like, no, we don't want this. We are not interested in that at all. Like, we want these are going to be highly efficient. We want passive house. We want cutting edge technology. That's the last mention we want of it. And you also have to respect those communities' positions too. Like, I find as a practitioner, one thing that I really try to emphasize with myself, my interns, is listening, because I mean, to Jake's point, I call myself Indigenous. Well, I'm a Métis person, so where I live, I'm a total guest. And even for Métis people in DC that I work with, I have to learn more about what they've been doing for generations out there in the West that is very different than where I grew up. So listening is critical and central to the whole conversation.
I think we're going to see if there are any questions from the audience. So Tobias Fellows, who's a principal in our Ottawa office. Tobias, do you want to come on? Do you have some interesting questions?
Yes, there's some great questions here, and thanks for the presentation and the discussion afterwards. The first question is from Daith Wong. David, thanks for bringing forth an enriched perspective to this complex discourse. I hear two interrelated topics today. One, nothing about us without us, the incredible discrepancy between Indigenous capacity and multi-million dollars set forth for Indigenous participation. Two, good design enriched with Indigenous thinking, learning and inspired from the land, sensitive regional response, design something your grandmother would be proud of. His question is, how do these two exist as parallel ideas on the long journey for truth and reconciliation? So, yeah.
I mean, it's a very interesting and challenging. Well, I guess the simple answer is not that simple. I guess I'm thinking like, I think Omiso mentioned this as well, that we're looking at our detachment from land and the sacredness of relationships, it took many generations for us to get to the point where we are. And I often try to think it's going to take many generations for this to kind of correct itself or move in a different direction back to some of those meaningful relationships. So the first step for me is to be patient. And that's hard for those of us that are in the thick of it right now. Like it's like our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren that really we're thinking about here. So that discrepancy is going to be felt right now. I think that for us, it's trying to hopefully inspire, and we know organically there are going to be more Indigenous youth getting into this field and thinking forward to that, because if you actually think about the barriers put in place for Indigenous people historically to become architects, it's actually a miracle that people like Douglas and Wanda and Patrick Stewart and the other, who that have established themselves, Brian Porter, it's actually a miracle that they're practicing and doing as well as they are. So they are true trailblazers and role models, and we will see that grow. So I think that is at the core of it. And the other thing is within that patience is, I'm very interested in this question of what is good design, to Dave's second question there. Like, I think we do this all the time. When Unseated was released in Venice, there were a lot of people that walked through that, very good architects that are just good design critics, that kind of walked through and were a bit bewildered and were kind of like, I was told multiple times, the project kind of missed the mark. Like, it could have been much more critical, could have done this and that. People are like, I was actually kind of disappointed in what I saw over there. And it's like, okay, but you know what, like, for what we wanted to do and what it did for our communities and voices and pride to our Indigenous people, it's a win. So like, for me, the metrics of success have to be really thought carefully, because architecture is not one narrative. It can be multiple narratives, and that's a better way to think about it, I think. I don't know about the others. Jake's just, they're skipping out on that one.
We've got it. Go ahead, Jake.
I looked at that question too. Nothing about us, nothing without us. I think David and Omi also heard me say this before, this long road ahead of us and the dilution that is going to occur with indigeneity because of the amount of people being populated in Canada. It's been 500 years. We're only 1.67 million Indigenous people. Canada in the last 3 years has inlet 1.65 million people. So, it's a long journey, but it's also a scary journey in terms of how this story is going to play out. Hopefully we'll have more participants becoming Indigenous architects, planners. But at the same time, there's the other side of, just fear of identity being diluted more and more over the next decades. So that's just something I'm always looking forward, what's around the corner.
I guess because I have a diluted identity, Jake.
Mm-hmm.
I love to make bad jokes, but it's true. So for me, I emphasize the teaching of our ancestors that I think has been demonstrated throughout this discussion, that being of like welcoming. This welcoming feeling of opening our arms to new ideas and new people. And I feel that there was two things that frightened me so much in David's presentation. And how do you say Poco Luani? Is that how you say it? That was so scary, because not only I'm not too fussed about necessarily diluted identities, because I really believe that being an Indigenous and Nahiyo person is something to be super proud of. And I believe that since I was 6, when I looked around and saw the other little brown kids around me, because I'm not very brown, and they were so ashamed. I was like, what are you ashamed of? We're the best people ever. So ever since then, I've been looking for the narratives and the stories and the strengths that we have, because we have so many, and so many of them underpin the way life is lived and should be lived. And we need to share that narrative and sense of humanity in order to make this place better for everybody, if that makes sense. But why that was so haunting to me, what Poco Luani Poca said, was because the pretendians are really doing that work so effectively. Like if anybody's diluting our identities, it's the people who are pretending to be Indigenous for literally no reason. And it's so important that people with critical perspectives of indigeneity, of, you know, that are grounded in some kind of tradition and thought and philosophy and worldview have the positions that we have, because you can't be just hired as an Indigenous person to be like a brownish, because I'm kind of a brownish face, not very dark. You know, it's more than that. We can't transform anything unless we're actually trying to transform it. And that takes a critical perspective. But the other thing that I found really haunting was the fact, when you're talking about defate, I worked there for a summer and hated it. I wanted to die because it was so awful and so conformist. And that's not my thing, you might have guessed. And so this concept of Canada's trying to sell itself. Meanwhile, in places like Mexico, we have companies that are implicated in gross human rights abuses. So behind our very own backs are people in our government, or the people of Canada and the government of Canada, and the countries that call themselves Canadian, or companies that call themselves Canadian, continue to do absolutely disgusting colonial and imperial things that include murdering and killing of Indigenous peoples. So I think for me, human solidarity is important, and emphasizing the wonderful things that Indigenous people from all of our nations actually provide to the world has always been my goal and message, if that makes sense. It is fearful, but we have something to offer. And if nobody wants to listen, they're totally missing out. Promise you that.
Tobias, I think we're going to have to move on because we've hit our time limit. Jake Omisu, I want to really thank you for being part of this and to me and to all of us at NORR, incredibly important discussion, and I think we've just started it, and it's going to continue for sure. And David, that was an incredibly excellent presentation. I went in. I think you said that you're going to the Venice Biennale, and there's something coming out soon. I want to wish you well at that. I think the Venice Biennale this is number 3 now for you at the Venice Biennale. It's 2. Okay. And I think Jake was there earlier, right? Jake, you were there in 2011. Yeah. So I think
this will be number 3. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So this is number 3. So I think for you guys, this is an important place for the world to be at the Venice Biennale, and I wish you all the best there. I think the last one was a great show, and I don't know who that architect said that they weren't impressed, but keep up the good work, because I think this is an incredibly important piece of work that you're doing, and I truly believe that the students that come out are going to change the world. They're certainly going to change Canada, and we're going to continue to obviously be supporters and continue to learn, which is what we do here at NORR. And thank you once again for doing this, NORR. All the very best to all of you.
Nice seeing you guys.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.